Here's what we're going to try. Here's what we're going to do, and we're going to try to keep this not extraordinarily formal, but I want to make sure we get through all the issues. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. I want to make sure that we get through all the issues, and here's the sequence of what we're going to be doing. But also feel free to inject questions or ask things, because that really is going to be the way for us to make sure that we're really responding to what you're doing. The first thing we're going to talk about is the very basics of what Citizens United has meant, which everyone to some extent has gotten, but to give everyone that's in this room a sense for what the ground rules really are for corporations and for other groups. And most importantly, to give something of a preview, and we've seen some talk of that already, of where corporations and other organizations need to be alert for what's coming down the pike with regard to issues like transparency, which is clearly going to be the issue that we're going to be discussing and fighting over for the next year. And we are extraordinarily fortunate to have with us, who's going to be speaking later, Wes Bazell, Counsel with Altria, that I think personally has one of the most sophisticated and advanced compliance programs in place, not just with regard to following the rules, but with regard to thinking through notions of brand management and how one voluntarily releases information beyond the minimal that's required, but does so in a way that allows corporations to make sure that they are protecting the brand as they engage in issue advocacy. And clearly Altria has a great deal of issue advocacy, some of it controversial, that it must engage in. And so we're going to talk through, and we've put in your materials far more information than we're actually going to be flashing on screens or actually talking about, but we wanted you to have it all there. And part of what we're going to talk about are some of the lessons learned that we have received from having represented clients in the situation where they're trying to embark on this process of what kind of best practices should we be putting in place with regard to our board, with regard to our shareholders, with regard to our media activities, and other things. And we're going to walk through what we think some of the things you might want to be taking back to the companies are going to be on how we do that. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Georgia. We're very fortunate to have Rick Thompson with us, former executive secretary of what was formerly known as the Georgia State Ethics Commission, might, if legislation that we see become the new name again of the Campaign Finance and Transparency Commission. And just talk a little bit at the end about what's happening in Georgia and what we need to be thinking about at the state compliance level if you're a national corporation. We're going to try to have everyone out by noon. That's sort of the unwritten rule. If you do anything beyond that, you're being just simply rude. So I'm going to try to do that, but we're going to stick around afterwards to answer questions if we don't get to your issues. So let me start really by talking about what's happening at the federal level, because historically, and let me actually back up. Everything that I'm saying at this point is not on behalf of any client, certainly not on behalf of any presidential candidate. The opinions and the mistakes are all mine, so please take that. And likewise, we do have media in the room. Feel free to ask questions. It's perfectly fine to ask questions about friends or competitors of yours. If you've seen a competitor has done something, you want to ask a question, you don't have to give your own name. I'm happy to answer hypothetical questions relating to your friends and competitors. My job used to be really easy. It used to be that I'd get the phone call from the general counsel who would say, look, my CEO was just watching MSNBC or just watching Fox News. She's all spun up about this issue. She wants to spend some Treasury dollars on some issue advocacy. You got to just help me talk her off the ledge. And my job was really easy to say, yep, here's the law. Here's why you can't do it. Here's why issue advocacy is not really, while some parts are legal, you really can't be getting into the kind of things that are directly influencing elections and helping talk people off the ledge to some extent. What Citizens United has done, it has wholesale changed the landscape. Everyone understands that corporations, while they might or might not be people, corporations and unions are clearly recognized to have First Amendment rights. And the First Amendment right that they have permits them to directly advocate for and against a federal candidate in any medium saying whatever they want to say. That is the fundamental shift that Citizens United has brought about. And while that might be good, there are huge pitfalls to us in exercising that right that we really have to be thinking through before we embark on that path. The first and foremost pitfall of that is the brand management, the reputational issue. And we will find, I'll say candidly, probably 80% of our clients, they say, I don't want anything to do with this. I'm interested, I want to know, but I don't want to have anything to do with politics, with campaigns. Government affairs is about as far as I want to get if I want to maybe do some lobbying. I don't want to do issue advocacy. And that generally reflects the attitude of most of our corporate clients. There is another 20%, however, especially in the age of TARP, especially in the age of a very comprehensive concentration of money and opportunities and resources concentrating with the government at the federal, state, and municipal level, where we have a number of clients that have recognized, while they might never have wanted to engage in the political process before, there are existential threats out there that if they're not acting to meet, could actually be the fundamental end of their corporation. A perfect example, we have some clients that are basing a component of their business model on provisions of the tax code. They base their model. They have worked very hard to base a very successful model on tax code. Well, they're starting to see now a lot of talk of, well, maybe we need to do away with all of these loopholes. Well, what's a loophole to 95% of the country is the lifeblood of this corporation. And they suddenly realize we need to engage on this issue. And we might need to engage in an issue where we're not popular. We might want to be preserving somebody's loopholes, or we might want to be preserving something, not because we suddenly want to get engaged in politics, but because it's an existential threat if we don't. We also have corporations that have recognized that there are huge opportunities now that never used to exist if one's willing to engage with government. And as companies think through this threat opportunity model, many more have started to come to the conclusion, we might not want to engage with politics, we might not want to spend money on this, but we have to. And that is where we want to start at least laying out the groundwork for what the issues are that you want to be thinking about to determine whether the culture of your company and whether the opportunities and threats out there merit considering some of these issues. And that's what I'm going to try to walk us through to some extent. The important thing to remember, and I've talked about this already, is that Citizens United really does fundamentally shift politics and fundamentally shifts issue advocacy. It's not just what we're hearing about when we say, well, I can go run an ad, or I might or might not want to run an ad. But if I am a very wealthy individual, or if I am a corporation, and I might have a government affairs strategy, I might never intend to run an ad in a congressman's district. Never. But I have the right to run an ad in a congressman's district. And if I walk into that congressman's office, and of course we would never advocate doing it, but I've heard that it happens, and say, you know, I can either be for you or against you in the next election. And I, by the way, can run ads in your district. Now let's talk about House Bill XYZ. You're going to have somebody's attention that you never used to have because of the right of these corporations and unions to directly engage in the political process. And we need to understand this is a First Amendment issue. This is a constitutional issue, which means by dictate of the Supreme Court, Congress can't change it, and it must apply in every state in the union. So any state that has any law that's contrary to these fundamental principles we're talking about is by definition unconstitutional. I believe it's Montana that subsequent to Citizens United said, well, we're Montana, we're going to do it differently, and they have in fact passed legislation that is contrary to Citizens United. I'm putting my money on the Supreme Court on that one, but we need to understand that these are state and federal rules. Now obviously here within Georgia, Citizens United doesn't change a great deal at the state level because we've had Citizens United, we've had the ability of corporations to engage in direct issue advocacy at the state level. So this is not as much a fundamental shift in Georgia, but at the national level, it certainly is. And really that's what these slides are talking about, that we now take back, we have a First Amendment right in any medium, which is to say we can go on TV, we can do mail, and we can also do intranet messages. I mean, any medium that we have to convey any message directly advocating for and against any candidate is available to us. Now, there are FEC regulations that are old, that are on the books, that talk about, well, corporations can't really advocate within their own company to their own employees. The FEC has tried to update its regulations to account for all of these changes that Citizens United has brought, and candidly, they can't even get together enough to issue regulations on what the Supreme Court has already passed. But I would submit, it's very clear to me, the First Amendment trumps all of these issues. So as a corporation, we really do have the right across any medium, including communicating with our employees, communicating with our shareholders, communicating on TV, any message we want. And that is because of the fundamental principle of the First Amendment that's driving all of this. We don't necessarily want to be the test case on this, but we do understand that this is out there. We do want to understand, though, that while the Supreme Court giveth, there are certain restrictions that we have to understand and are taking back to our companies. The primary one is that the Supreme Court, when they were looking at this First Amendment principle, said, yes, we recognize that there's this First Amendment right out here that corporations have. But we also have to be concerned, on the other hand, with the notion that there's this real potential for corruption. If we have a corporation or a union or a wealthy individual able to give direct money to a candidate, or if we have a wealthy individual or corporation coordinating or communicating that message with them, there is this real concern that that individual is going to have undue influence and the ability to corrupt the process. That's the theory, at least, behind the rule. Now, whether, again, Sheldon Adelson, who has been widely reported in the news as financing winning the future super PAC aligned with Newt Gingrich, whether he'd have difficulty getting a phone call through to Newt Gingrich, we'd have to see. But that's the theory, that by having these independent groups, you're at least maintaining that line that, well, as long as they're operating independently of the candidate or the party, the First Amendment controls. That's an important takeaway for us in this room, because people will read and sort of get a facial understanding of what super PACs or of what Citizens United means and think, I'm going to go right out to my candidate, I'm going to start talking about all the stuff that we're going to do. As soon as your CEO talks about conversations that they're having with a member of Congress or with a party or anything, alarm bells need to be going off that we're suddenly getting out of this protected sphere of Citizens United and getting into coordinating communications that, by definition under the Supreme Court, are just as illegal now as they used to be. So everything has to remain very separate. The real issue that's out there right now that comes up the most are two significant issues. One of them relates to the notion of, what do I do if I'm a domestic subsidiary of a foreign national? Do we have anyone in the room who's in that situation? We might not. Good. Okay. I'm only going to spend a few minutes on this then, 1 minute on this. The rules have not changed with regard to the ability of foreign nationals to control elections. You remember in the State of the Union 2 back, where right after Citizens United came out, and the president is somewhat indignant about what this means for our democracy, this ruling, and he specifically called out Justice Alito, who was kind of shrunk and was like, no, it's not true. What that whole issue was about was that the president was saying Citizens United means that now foreign corporations and foreign nationals have the ability to control our elections. What Justice Alito was saying in that little exchange was, no, that's not true. What the Supreme Court just ruled last week in a somewhat unusual one-page affirmance, which allowed them to avoid having to write all this, issued an opinion of Blumen decision, which was candidly, it was just a bunch of Harvard law kids who got together, who figured this was going to be a really good test case, and they actually got to the Supreme Court, which were foreign nationals who wanted to engage in election advocacy. And what the Supreme Court said, and I think Justice Alito probably had a lot to do with this, was to say, no, we meant what we said before. The rules with regard to foreign nationals have not changed, which is to say, if we have a PAC in our corporation, we cannot have foreign nationals serving on our PAC committee. If we have a foreign parent, the foreign parent cannot control our PAC or our issue advocacy or all of our rights under Citizens United. We just need to understand that this exchange that happened 2 years ago was just affirmed by the Supreme Court. There are things that domestic corporations can do, but we just need to make sure we're understanding the rule and that, in fact, it remains the case that foreign nationals cannot control domestic U.S. elections or independent issue advocacy. And that's all, and that's going to be in the materials. Here's where the rubber hits the road, the second issue, where the rubber really hits the road. And we heard a fair amount of this already. The real idea is not so much that people think we can put the toothpaste back in the tube when it comes to advocacy. The real issue out there is transparency, understanding who's paying for these ads. That's the piece that 95% of the country in polling says, well, that's what we want. If somebody's going to be spending this money to influence elections and can do so very effectively, we want to know who. This came up very early. One of the donors to the Romney Super PAC was a corporation, an XYZ corporation, that basically was created. It had no discernible name. It gave a significant amount of money to the Super PAC, and then it dissolved. And of course, everyone was like, well, wait a minute. Is this a way to avoid the disclosure? Well, it turned out that it was incorporated within the offices of Bain in Massachusetts. And public scorn quickly outed the, in fact, coincidentally, Bain executive who had done that. It's not at the Super PAC level. It's not likely that we're going to be able to conceal the donors to the Super PACs. The laws have changed, and I've got more in the materials that I'm going to talk through here, that have actually allowed the Super PACs to change as of January their methodology of how they're reporting, to go to a month-by-month reporting that actually has allowed all of the Super PACs to put off until the end of January all of their spending in January. We don't know who's been giving to the Super PACs all throughout January, but we will. We need to understand that as our corporations are starting to think about the issue advocacy, what are the implications to us as we do that? The other piece that we want to understand is there is a call out there to some small portion of the country or some small portion of corporations that feel that they have a need to advocate in a non-transparent way, basically anonymous speech. And that issue is out there, and that issue is one that I want to spend a little bit of time on because we have a number of clients who understand that they might not be able to take the most politically correct view. If you're an offshore oil driller, if you are a tax code corporation, anything like that, you might not want the weight of public opinion against you. So what we are going to need to understand is what these different kinds of groups are, how they work, so we can at least understand, taking back, what are the kind of issues that we want to be thinking through. There are different types of tax-exempt organizations which have different rules to them. We've talked a lot about Super PACs. We're not going to spend too much more time on that. There are other kinds of organizations that are directly political organizations which are called 527s. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that because they're fundamentally transparent organizations. The organizations that I want to spend some time on are what are called social welfare organizations, which are organized under Section 501c4 of the tax code. Now, what those organizations are is they're organizations that can't have political activity as their primary purpose. It's just an ancillary purpose. But if this organization's primary purpose is making the world better, by however they choose to define it, we want to have drilling 1 mile off of our shores, we want to clean coal, we want whatever the issue is. If it's issue advocacy, that's social welfare. The important thing about a social welfare organization is they don't have to disclose who their donors are. As long as their primary purpose is advocating whatever they define their issue to be, they might have to reveal their donors to the IRS, but it never becomes public. These organizations are, in fact, allowed to engage in government affairs lobbying activity, to engage in issue advocacy, direct independent expenditures, none of which are disclosing their identity of their donors. And this is the current law, and this is the area where all the controversy is that we want to be sure that we're understanding. And again, I've got more in the materials here that I'm going to need to show you. Super PACs are going to be disclosing. We do not, under any circumstances, want to be creating some sort of shell corporations for the purpose of routing funds through, because that money is going to get disclosed. There's far too much interest in what Super PACs are doing to think that we're not going to be disclosing at some extent. And the reason why this is important is because we got to keep our corporate logo out of the bullseye here. We got to understand we can spend millions of dollars on brand management and brand awareness, and in one small swoop undo all of the work that we've done, antagonize our customers, antagonize half of our workforce, and we just don't want to be engaged there. The classic example that we need to be concerned with when it comes to these issues is Target. And we've talked a little bit about Target, but here's what happened with Target. It's not as bad, even as Governor Dean is wrong about that when he talked about the contribution flow chain. The way that Target actually got itself in a significant amount of trouble was that it gave its money to a fairly vanilla one of these 501c4 social welfare organizations. Very much a pro-business organization. Lower taxes, less regulation, nothing controversial about the funds that they were giving to the 501c4 organization. The 501c4 organization, though, turned around and gave its money to a Minnesota gubernatorial candidate who shared the values of the social welfare organization, lower taxes, less regulation, but also had strongly held views on social issues, gay marriage primarily, were very strongly held by this governor, this gubernatorial candidate. This gubernatorial candidate, in the context of running for office, shows up at a rally that is solely affiliated with the social welfare, with the social issues, and has all sorts of ugly, hateful things that they publicize about gay marriage and everything else. Well, MoveOn.org identified this little daisy chain that I've put up here and blasts all over their entire outreach network. Target is anti-gay marriage. Well, Target has spent millions and millions of dollars promoting itself as the exact opposite and found itself in one small issue advocacy in one state in a completely non-controversial way in a firestorm that cost millions of dollars to undo. We need to be thinking through all of the ramifications of this, and this is why there is still, I think, a great deal of call for some degree of advocacy by some corporations that doesn't ultimately work its way out into the realm. And here's the way that this works, and it's very important to understand what the transparency issues that everyone's so concerned with is. The way this works is it starts, like everything in politics always does, with a big bag full of money, right? So the big bag full of money goes from whatever source that it went to one of these 501c4 tax-exempt organizations that always has a wonderful sounding name. People for Ethical and Transparent Elections, People Who Love Puppies, People to Save Our Environment, whatever the group is, and they're operating lawfully as an organization that promotes whatever their social agenda is. That organization, in turn, has the right to give money to a super PAC, in Georgia what's called an independent political committee, or some other organization that engages in direct advocacy for and against candidates. Well, under federal law, under state law, that organization, any organization that engages in that activity, needs to be transparent and disclose its donors, right? So they disclose they've received money from People in Ethical and Transparent Elections. Well, then the media and everyone else goes running backwards to them saying, okay, well, show us who gave you your money. No disclosure. This is the issue that has everyone most concerned right now. Completely legal under the law, but the ability to route money through an organization and in a completely legal way have the ultimate organization say whatever it wants, issue advocacy, direct election communications, and not have the ability to route back to the ultimate donor, the corporation, the union, the wealthy individual. This is perfectly legal, and this is the issue that's the battleground and is going to be the battleground that we need to be watching going forward. The reason why it's so important is because while there's lots of talk of trying to undo this, what I think most people would agree is probably not ideal and optimal for our electorate and for our corporations, or for our country, is this notion of anonymous speech. And the case that I've not seen anywhere really raised as part of this whole analysis, but I am certain is going to have to be considered as part of it, is what happened with the NAACP in the 50s in Alabama. NAACP in the 50s in Alabama is organizing itself, and the state of Alabama says, well, any organization within our state needs to disclose its membership so that we can send some squad cars by and make sure everything's okay with the membership. We want to check on the, make sure that everything's fine. So if you NAACP can just tell us who your membership is, then you're fine, and we'll just make sure to protect all of the membership of the NAACP. NAACP in the 50s in Alabama says, well, thank you so much for that opportunity to be protected by you, but our ability to exist, our ability to speak, our freedom of association guaranteed under the First Amendment cannot exist if we're required to divulge our membership to the state. Now that issue goes back and forth to the Supreme Court of Alabama, which rules, well, of course not. It goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court several times. Each time the U.S. Supreme Court says, no, the right to associate, the right to speech has to allow the NAACP not to reveal its membership. Alabama Supreme Court never gets it, keeps going back and forth until finally they realize the U.S. Supreme Court trumps the Alabama Supreme Court. And it's a completely non-controversial decision. 9-0, never challenged, shouldn't be challenged. But the notion that sometimes the fundamental core rights to associate and to speak require some groups and some organizations to be able to do so anonymously. Because sometimes you have groups that want to take an unpopular position at the time, but might be very good for our democracy, might be very good. And the First Amendment, freedom of right, freedom of speech, and freedom of association has to protect that. Now, I am in no way advocate or saying that the travails of offshore oil drillers are the same as the NAACP in the 50s and the significant physical threats that they recognized. And in fact, the Supreme Court, in a recent opinion, has recognized a case called Doe versus Reed, has said there is this line. At one end, if you want to engage in very political process, the Doe versus Reed case related to, I want to have ballot initiatives, I want to put my name on a ballot, but I don't want to reveal my name if I'm trying to do a ballot initiative. There, the Supreme Court said, look, you're engaging in an inherently political public process, putting your name on a ballot initiative. You don't have any expectation of privacy there at that end. But clearly upheld at the other end, the NAACP standard, which is to say, if there are threats or if there is any indication that you might be subject to either scorn or ridicule or physical threat, you absolutely have the right to speak and associate anonymously. This gray area in between is exactly where our issue advocacy is going to be falling. And we need to understand it is not going to be as easy as a lot in the media and a lot of the punditry says to basically just wave our wand and say anyone who's giving money, anyone who's associating is going to have to reveal who they are. There are strong constitutional issues that are going to prevent that, which I think are fundamentally good for the country. But we need to understand that this is out there, and we need to understand the threat that's coming. There are a number of different issues that we just want to have our eye, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time. It's in the materials. You can take a look at it. But these are the issues that we want to keep our eye on as corporations, as unions, and as wealthy individuals, where people are trying to get behind the curtain, figure out what corporations are giving to these 501c4s so that we can force them to disclose who their donors are. These are the issues. The first one, everyone's pretty well aware of. There's this legislation called the Disclose Act, tried to go through Congress. Under a Democratic administration with a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate, this bill couldn't pass. Don't look for this bill to pass anytime soon. But basically what this bill was going to require was this type of disclosure as a congressional level to get around the First Amendment issues that we've been describing before. This is still out there, and it's out there in new forms now under the current administrations, legislative administrations. We have, at the House level, the real battlefront that we want to be looking at is shareholder disclosure issues. The notion that either through the Securities and Exchange Commission or through federal legislation, this shareholder or board right to know laws that stand for the principle, if you as a corporation are going to put your money into the stream that's going to ultimately result in this type of advocacy, you need to get approval from your board, you need to get approval from your shareholders, you need to be publicly disclosing it. All of these notions are designed to get around the protections of Citizens United or the wrong decision, depending on your perspective. We want to keep our eyes on all those. I don't candidly look for a lot of these to go forward. Congress, it's like the FEC. You're not going to see anything really happening in Congress, especially something that involves politics. I also don't look for anything to happen at the Federal Election Commission for the reasons I've described, but we want to keep our eye on that. Where the real issue is going to be at the IRS, this notion of whether the IRS is going to mandate disclosure for these 501c4 type organizations, at the federal FCC, Communications Commission, but most importantly for us at the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is where there's going to be some real issues of there's constantly this battle to require corporations to disclose, get approval from their board, from their shareholders for campaign activity. And the last one that's not on the slides, because it's one I'm just not sure where it's going, but is probably the most important, is anyone who's engaged in federal procurement. There is an executive order that the current White House is examining to require, if you want to do business with the federal government, part of your RFP process is going to require disclosure to all of these issue advocacy groups. Now, that is a real issue for me. If I am trying to get a federal procurement, if I'm going to have to go to a federal procurement officer and say, I gave money to MoveOn.org, I gave money to Karl Rove, and if I'm worried about someone like a Rahm Emanuel in the White House, I can't be confident that there's not going to be some degree of looking at what's my advocacy? Am I a good company or a bad one because I've exercised my First Amendment rights? And maybe a shifting of the procurement rules towards the companies that are considered to be good companies versus bad companies, the picking of winners and losers in the purest political sense. This issue is currently, as we speak, under consideration with the White House. Ironically, there's not a great deal of transparency. They're not revealing what their meetings are. They're not revealing what they're saying. The White House isn't disclosing what they're doing, but it is authorized under federal law, and we need to keep our eye on that, especially if we're engaged in any type of federal procurement activity, because this is the kind of issue that's going to be coming towards us in the future, and we don't want to find ourselves in a position where we've engaged in issue advocacy or other types of advocacy, and then suddenly we're trying to get in front of the federal government for a procurement, and suddenly a new executive order has come forth saying, show us over the last 2 years what your issue advocacy has been. So we want to keep our eye on that. I've thrown a fair amount at us now. What we're going to do, the next part of what we're going to discuss is going to be, if I've done my job, everyone's sitting here going, well, forget it. We're not, this is crazy. I'm not going to do any of this stuff. Why would I want to do that? What we want to do is talk through what corporations, what sophisticated corporations have done that feel like they have to be engaged in the process. We can't sit on the sidelines. We have to engage. We know this is a mess. We know we're in the middle of a mess that's transforming. We don't know what all the rules are going to be. We know the last thing we can do is mess up our brand. We can't allow that to happen. We can't antagonize our customers or our shareholders or our employees. So what are the things we as a corporation should be doing now to deal with this mess that we have? So when we come back, we're going to take a real quick break.